Hi everyone. In this video, you will be introduced to the quadratic formula, the information you can get from it, and how to use what's called the discriminant. So here's the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Sounds really complicated, right? But at the end of the day, you guys have been evaluating expressions for a really long time. And if you follow these steps, it shouldn't be too difficult. In order to use the quadratic formula, your quadratic needs to be in standard form, where everything is on the left side and it is equal to 0. There are two key pieces of information that you can pull out of the quadratic formula. The first is negative b over 2a. Think way back to the beginning of the quarter when we were working with the vertex. There's the formula for the axis of symmetry. This is the coordinate of the x-coordinate of the vertex. The second important piece of information that becomes very useful is b squared minus 4ac, and that's called the discriminant. The discriminant tells you how many solutions or x-intercepts that the quadratic will have. And this is what we're going to focus on today. So let's do a quick square root review. When we take the square root of a positive number, we end up with two solutions. The square root of 36 is 6, but it's also negative 6. When we take the square root of a negative number, the calculator gives us an error message. And we have no real solutions. And when we take the square root of 0, we just end up with 0. Okay? So that is why we end up having that discriminant being so important. Okay? So, when you go to solve a quadratic using the quadratic formula, start with the discriminant. Identify your a, b, and c, and then plug them into b squared minus 4ac. Because if b squared minus 4ac is bigger than 0, then you're taking the square root of a positive number, and you end up with two real solutions. If you find the discriminant to be 0, then in the quadratic formula, this whole piece just cancels out. And we don't have anything to add or subtract, and all we're left with is the x-coordinate of the vertex, which means that the vertex lies on the x-axis, and we only have one x-intercept, which means that we end up with one real solution. If we calculate the discriminant and we find that it's less than 0, then we are supposed to take the square root of a negative number. But we can't do that. We end up with an error message. And in this case, we end up with no real solutions. Now, I like ending with a negative number under the square root symbol because then I can stop working on my problem. Because the answer is there is no answer. All right, so let's put this to practice. So here's example 1. Our first step is to identify a, b, and c. A is the number in front of x squared. B is the number in front of x. And c is the constant that stands alone. Okay? So then we're going to use the discriminant. Write it down. If you write the formula down every time, 1, you're more likely to remember it, and 2, you're less likely to make a mistake with your substitution. When you go to substitute your values, make sure that you put those numbers, especially if they're negative, in parentheses. So I replace b with negative 8, a with 3, and c with 3. And then this thing, you can just string right into the calculator. But make sure that you put those parentheses in there. So I've got negative 8 squared minus 4, parentheses 3, parentheses 3. And I end up with a positive number. So how many solutions is this quadratic going to have? 2. All right, let's try it again. We're going to identify A, B, and C. Remember that the invisible coefficient of a variable is always 1. So A is 1, B is 2, and C is 1. So I write my discriminant down. B squared minus 4AC. Substitute my values in. I'm not going to use the calculator for this one. I know that 2 squared is 4. And I know that 4 times 1 times 1 is also 4. And 4 minus 4 equals 0. And since my discriminant is 0, that whole back portion of the numerator cancels out, and we're just left with the x-coordinate of the vertex. So our quadratic will have one real solution. All right, last example. In this example, we can't do step 1 yet because our pre-step is to make sure that our quadratic is in standard form. So I need to take this minus 2 and move it to the other side of the equation with addition so that everything is on the same side of the equal sign. Now I can identify my A, my B, and my C. I write my discriminant down, B squared minus 4AC. I replace B with negative 2. I replace A with positive 1. And I replace C with positive 2. So negative 2 squared is positive 4. 4 times 1 is 4, times 2 is 8. So I have 4 minus 8. And 4 minus 8 is negative 4. So in the quadratic formula, I'd have to end up putting the square root of negative 4, and we can't do that. Since the discriminant is negative, we end up with no real solutions. Now, I want to be sure that you understand, just because we end up with no real solutions doesn't mean that we don't have a parabola. It just means that my parabola is hanging out in 1/2 of the coordinate plane. Okay? So that's it. Complete the following practice problems. Find the discriminant and tell me the number of solutions that you end up with for that quadratic. Make sure to have them checked before moving on.